Ranger's Apprentice, Book 1, The Ruins of Gorlan, by John Flanagan. Chapter 13. So you saw it. What did you think? Sir Rodney asked. Carol reached across and poured himself another tankard from the jug of beer that was on the table between them. Rodney's quarters were simple enough, even Spartan, when it was remembered that he was the head of the battle school. Battlemasters and other thieves took advantage of the position to surround themselves with the trappings of luxury, but that wasn't Rodney's style. His room was simply furnished with a pinewood table for a desk and 6 straight-backed pine chairs around it. There was a fireplace in the corner, of course. Rodney might have preferred to live in a simple style, but that didn't mean he enjoyed discomfort, and winters in Castle Redmond were cold. Right now it was late summer, and the thick stone walls of the castle building served to keep the interiors cool. When the cold weather came, those same thick walls would retain the heat of the fire. On one wall, a large bay window looked out over the battle school's drill field. Facing the window on the opposite wall was a doorway screened by a thick curtain leading to Rodney's sleeping quarters. A simple soldier's bed and more wooden furniture. It had been a little more ornate when the wife Antoinette was still alive, but she had died some years previously, and the rooms were now unmistakably masculine in character, without any item in them that wasn't functional and with an absolute minimum of decoration. I saw it, Carol agreed. Not sure that I believed it, but I saw it. You only saw it once. He was doing it constantly throughout the session, and I'm convinced that he was doing it unconsciously. As fast as the one I saw? Rodney nodded emphatically. If anything, faster. He was adding an extra stroke to the routines, but staying in the time with the call. He hesitated, then finally said what they were both thinking. He's a natural. Carol inclined his head thoughtfully. Based on what he'd seen, he wasn't prepared to dispute the fact, and the battlemaster had been watching the boy for some time during the session, he knew. But naturals were far and few. They were those unique people for whom the skilled swordplay moved in and to an entirely different dimension. It became not so much a skill as an instinct to them. They were the ones who became the champions, the sword masters. Experienced warriors like Sir Rodney and Sir Carol were expert swordsmen, but naturals took the skill to a higher plane. It was as if for them the sword in their hand became a true extension, not just of their bodies, but of their personalities as well. The sword seemed to act in an instant communion and harmony with the natural's mind, acting even faster than conscious thought. Naturals were possessed of unique skills in timing and balance and rhythm. As such, they presented a heavy responsibility to those who were entrusted with their training. For those natural skills and abilities had to be carefully nurtured and developed in a long-term training program to allow the warrior, already highly proficient, as a matter of course, to develop his true potential for genius. You sure? Said Carol eventually, and Rodney nodded again, his gaze out the window. In his mind he was seeing the boy training, seeing those extra flickers of lightning-fast movement. I'm sure, he said simply. We'll have to let Wallace know that he'll have another pupil next semester. Wallace was the sword master at the Redmond Battle School. He was the one who had the responsibility for adding the final polish to the basic skills that Carol and the others taught. In the event of an outstanding trainee, as Horace obviously was, he would give them private instruction in advanced techniques. Carol curled his bottom lip thoughtfully as he thought about the time frame Rodney had suggested. Not until then? The next semester was almost 3 months away. Why not get him started straight away? From what I saw, he's already mastered the basic stuff. But Rodney shook his head. We haven't really assessed his personality yet. He seems a nice enough lad, but you never know. If he turns out to be a misfit of some kind, I don't want to give him the sort of advanced instruction that Wallace can provide. Once you thought about it, Carol agreed with the battlemaster. After all, if it should turn out that Horace had disqualified from battle school because of some other failing, it might be embarrassing, not to mention dangerous, if he were already on the road to being a highly trained swordsman. Qualified trainees often reacted with resentment. And another thing, Rodney added, Let's keep this to ourselves and tell Morton the same. I don't want the boy hearing any word of this. It might make him cocky, and that could be dangerous for him." "That's true enough," Carol agreed. He finished the last of his beer in 2 quick draughts, set his tankard down on the table, and stood. "Well, I'd better be getting along. I've got reports to finish." "Who hasn't?" the battlemaster said with some feeling, and the 2 old friends exchanged rueful grins. "I never knew there was so much paper involved in running a battle school." Carol nodded in derision. "Sometimes I think we should forget the weapons training and just throw all the paper at the enemy, bury them in it." Carol gave an informal salute, touching one finger to his forehead. That was in keeping with his seniority. Then he turned and headed for the door. He paused as Rodney added one last point to the discussion. "Keep an eye on the boy, of course, but don't let him become aware of it." "Of course. We don't want him to start thinking that there's something special about him." At that moment, there was no chance that Horace would think there was anything special about him, at least not in any positive sense. What he did feel was that there was something about him that attracted trouble. Word had gone around that the strange scene at the training grounds, his classmates not understanding what had happened, all assumed that Horace had somehow annoyed the battlemaster and now waited for the inevitable retribution. They knew that the rule during the first semester was that when one member of class made a mistake, the entire class paid for it. As a result, the atmosphere in that dormitory had been strained, to say the least. Horace had finally made his way out of the room, intending to head for the river to escape the condemnation and blame. He could feel it from the others. Unfortunately, when he did so, he walked straight into the waiting arms of Alden, Bryn, and Jerome. The 3 older boys had heard the garbled version of the scene at the practice yard. They assumed that Horace had been criticized for his sword work and decided to make him suffer for it. However, they knew that their attentions would not necessarily meet with the approval of the battle school staff. Horace, as a newcomer, had no way of knowing that this sort of systematic bullying was totally disapproved of by Sir Rodney and the other instructors. Horace simply assumed that that was the way things were supposed to be. Not knowing any better, went along with it, allowing himself to be bullied and insulted. It was for this reason that the 3 second-year cadets marched Horace to the riverside, where he had been heading anyway, and away from the sight of the instructors. Here they made him wade thigh-deep into the river, then stand to attention. "Baby can't use his sword properly," said Alda. Bryn took up the refrain. "Baby made the battlemaster angry. Baby doesn't belong in battle school. Baby shouldn't be giving swords to play with." "Baby should throw stones instead," Jerome concluded this sarcastic litany. "Pick up a stone, baby." Horace hesitated, then glanced around. The riverbed was full of stones, and he bent to get one. As he did so, his sleeve and the upper part of his jacket became soaked. "Not a small stone, baby," Alda said, smiling evilly at him. "You're a big baby, so you need a big stone." "A great big stone," Bryn added, indicating with his hand that he wanted Horace to pick up a large rock. Horace looked around him and saw several larger pieces in the crystal clear water. He bent and retrieved one of them. In doing so, he made a mistake. The rock he chose was easy to lift under the water, but as he brought it above the surface, he grunted with the weight of it. "Let's see it, baby. Hold it up," said Jerome. Horace braced himself. The swiftly running current of the river made it difficult to keep his balance and hold the heavy rock at the same time. Then he lifted it to his chest, so his tormentors could see it. "Right up, baby," Alda commanded. "Right over your head." Painfully, Horace obeyed. The rock was feeling heavier by the second, but he held it high above his head, and the 3 boys were satisfied. "That's good, baby," Jerome said, and Horace, with a relieved sigh, began to let the rock down again. "What are you doing?" demanded Jerome angrily. "I said that's good, so that's where I want the rock to stay." Horace struggled and lifted the rock above his head once more, holding it at arm's length. Alda, Bryn, and Jerome nodded their approval. "Now you can stay there," Alda told him, "while you count to 500. Then you can go back to the dormitory." "Start counting," Bryn ordered him, grinning at the idea. 1, 2, 3, began Horace, but they all shouted at him almost immediately. "Not so fast, baby! Nice and slowly. Start again. 1, 2, 3, Horace counted, and they nodded their approval. "That's better. Now a nice and slow count to 500 and you can go." "Don't try to fudge it, because we'll know," threatened Jerome. "And you'll be back here counting to 1,000. Laughing among themselves, the 3 students headed back to their quarters. Horace remained in midstream, arms trembling with the weight of the rock, tears of frustration and humiliation filling his eyes. Once he lost his balance and he fell full length in the water. After that, his heavy, sodden clothing made it all the harder to hold the rock above his head, but he kept at it. He couldn't be sure that they weren't concealed somewhere watching him. Then if they were, they'd make him pay for disobeying the instructions. If this was the way of things, then so be it, he thought. But he promised himself that the first chance he got, he was going to make somebody pay for the humiliation he was undergoing. Much later, clothes soaked, arms aching, and a deep feeling of resentment burning in his heart, he crept back to his quarters. He was too late for the evening meal, but he didn't care. He was too miserable to eat. Chapter 14. "Walk him around a little," said Holt. Will glanced back at the shaggy pony, who watched him with intelligent eye. "Come on, boy," he said, and pulled on the halter. Instantly, Tuck braced his forelegs and refused to move. Will pulled hard on the rope, leaning back on his effort to make the stubborn little pony move. Old Bolt cackled with laughter. "He be stronger than you," he said. Will felt his ears reddening with embarrassment. He pulled harder. Tuck twitched his ears and resisted. It was like trying to pull a horse along. "Don't look at him. Just take the rope and walk away with him. He'll follow," Holt said softly. Will tried it that way. He turned his back on Tuck, seized the rope, firmly began walking. The pony trotted easily after him. Will looked at Holt and grinning. The ranger nodded his head towards the far fence in the paddock. Will glanced across and saw a small saddle placed across the top rail of the fence. "Saddle him up." Tuck clip-clopped docilely across to the fence. Will looped the reins around the fence rail and hefted the saddle across the pony's back. He bent down to fasten the girth strap of the saddle. "Pull and good and tight," Old Bud advised him. Finally, the saddle was firmly in position. Will looked eagerly at Holt. "Can I ride him now?" he asked. The ranger stroked his uneven beard thoughtfully before he answered. "If you feel that's a good idea, go ahead," he said finally. Will hesitated for a moment. That phrase stirred a vague memory with him, and then eagerness overcame caution, and he put one foot on the stirrup and swung himself nimbly in onto the pony's back. Toots stood unmoving. "Get up," Will said, drumming his heel against the pony's sides. For a moment nothing happened. Then Will felt a small tremor of movement going through the pony's body. Suddenly Tuck arched his muscular little back and shot straight into the air, all 4 feet leaving the ground at the same time. He twisted violently to one side, came down on his front legs, and kicked his rear legs high into the sky. Will sailed neatly over the pony's ears, turned a complete somersault in the air, and crashed on his back in the dirt. He picked himself up, rubbing his back. Tuck stood nearby, ears up, watching him intently. "Now why did you go and do a silly thing like that?" the eye seemed to say. Old Bob leaned against the fence sides, heaving with laughter. Will looked at Holt. "What did I do wrong?" he asked. Holt dug under the fence rails and walked across to where Tuck stood, watching the 2 of them expectantly. He handed the bridle back to Will, then laid one hand on his shoulder. "Nothing if this were an ordinary horse, but Tuck has been trained as a ranger's horse." "What's the difference?" Will interrupted angrily, and Holt held his hand up for silence. "The difference is, each ranger horse has to be asked before the rider mounts him for the first time. They're trained that way, so that they can never be stolen." Will scratched his head. I never heard of such a thing, he said. Old Bob smiled as he walked forward. Not too many folks have, he said. That's why them ranger horses never get stolen. Will, said Will. What do you say to a ranger horse before you mount them? Hall shrugged. It varies from horse to horse. Each one responds to a different request. He gestured towards the larger horse. My horse, for example, responds to the words, Permettez-moi. Permettez-moi? Will echoed. What sort of words are that? They're Gallic, they mean, will you allow me? His parents came from Gallica, you see. Holt explained. Then he turned to old Bob. What are the words for took here, Bob? Bob screwed up his eyes, pretending that he couldn't remember. Then his face cleared. Ah, yes, I recall. This one here, he needs to be asked, do you mind before you got on his back? Do you mind? Will repeated, and Bob shook his head. Don't say it to me, youngster. Say it in the horse's ear. Feeling a little silly and not at all sure that the others weren't having a joke at his expense, Will stepped forward and said softly in Took's ear, Do you mind? Took whined softly. Will looked doubtfully at the two men, and Bob nodded encouragement. Go on, climb on now. Young Took won't harm you now. Very carefully, Will swung himself onto the pony's shaggy back once again. His back still ached from the previous attempt. He sat there a moment. Nothing happened. Then he tapped his heels gently onto Took's ribs. Come on, boy, he said softly. Took's ears twitched up and he stepped forward at an easy walk. Still cautious, Will let him walk around the paddock once or twice, then tapped again with his heels. Took broke into a gentle trot. Will moved easily to the rhythm of the horse's movement, and Hall looked on approvingly. The boy was an instinctive rider. The ranger unclipped the short length of the rope that held the paddock gate closed, and swung the wide gate open. Take him out, Will, and see what he really can do. Obediently, Will turned the pony toward the gate, and as they passed through onto the open ground beyond, tapped once more with his heels. He felt the muscular little body beneath him bunch momentarily, then Took broke into a fast gallop. The wind rushed past Will's ears as he leaned forward over the pony's back, encouraging him to even greater speed. Took's ears pricked upward in response, and he went even faster than before. He was like the wind. His short legs were a blur of motion as he carried the boy at full speed towards the edge of the trees. Gently, not sure how the pony would react, Will applied pressure to the left-hand rein. Instantly, Took veered to the left, racing away from the trees at an angle. Will kept a gentle pressure on the rein until Took was headed once again back towards the paddock. Will gasped in amazement as he saw how far they'd come. Holt and old Bob were tiny figures in the distance now, but they grew rapidly larger as Took flew over the rough grass towards them. A fallen log loomed in front of them, and before Will could make any effort to avoid it, Took had gathered himself, steadied, and leaped over the obstacle. Will let out a shout of excitement, and the pony whined briefly in reply. They were almost back to the paddock now, and Will pulled gently on both reins. Instantly, Took slowed to a canter, then a trot, finally coming down to a walking pace as Will maintained the pressure on the reins. He brought the pony to a standstill beside Holt. Took tossed his shaggy head and whined again. Will leaned forward and patted the pony on the back. He's terrific, he said breathlessly. He's as fast as the wind. Holt nodded gravely. Perhaps not quite as fast as the wind, but he can certainly cover ground. He turned to the old man. You've done well with him, Bob. Old Bob ducked his head in appreciation and leaned forward to pat the shaggy little pony in his turn. He had spent his life breeding, training, and preparing the Ranger Corps' horses, and this one ranked among the best he'd seen. He'll keep that pace all day, he said fondly. Run him fat and battle horse it into the ground, this one will. Youngster rides him well too, Ranger, don't he? Holt stroked his beard. Not too badly. Bob was scandalized. Not too badly? You heard a man, Ranger. Youngster said him light as a feather through the jump. The old man looked up at Will, sitting astride the pony and nodded appreciation. "You don't say away at them reins like some do, neither. Got a light touch with a horse's soft mouth, yes?" Will grinned at the old horse's trainer's praise. He sneaked a quick look at Holt, but the ranger was as grave-faced as ever. He never smiles, Will thought to himself. He went to dismount, then stopped himself hurriedly. "Is there anything I should say to him before I get off?" Bob laughed aloud. "No, youngster. Once said, and young Took here will remember. As long as it's you who's riding him." Relieved, Will climbed down. He stood beside the pony and Took shoved him affectionately with his head. Will glanced at the apple barrel. "Could I give him another one?" he asked. Holt nodded. "Just one more. But don't go making a habit of it. He'll be too fat to run if you feed him all the time." Took snorted loudly. Apparently he and Holt were at odds over how many apples the pony should have in a day. Will spent the rest of the day getting tips on riding technique from old Bob and learning how to look after and repair Took's saddle and harness, as well as the finer points of caring for the little horse. He brushed and carried the shaggy coat until it shone, and Took seemed to appreciate his effort. Finally, worn out, his arms aching with the effort, he had slumped to a seat on a hay bale, which of course had to be the exact moment when Holt walked into the stable. "Come along. No time to be lolling around doing nothing. We'd best get moving if we're to be home before dark." And so saying, he tossed the saddle across the back of his horse. Will didn't bother to protest. He hinted that he hadn't been lolling around, as the ranger put it. For a start, he knew it would be no use, and secondly, he was excited by the fact that he would be riding back to Holt's little cottage by the edge of the forest. It seemed that the two horses were to become a permanent part of the establishment. He realized now that Holt's horse had obviously been so before, and that the ranger had only been waiting until Will had shown his ability to ride and to bond with Took before reclaiming him from his temporary home in old Bob's stable. The horse whined to each other from time to time as they trotted back through the dim green forest, for all the world as if they were carrying on their own conversation. Will was bursting with questions he wanted to ask, but by now he was weary of chattering too much in the ranger's presence. Finally, he could contain himself no longer. "Holt?" he said experimentally. The ranger grunted. Will took that as a sign that he could continue speaking. "What's your horse's name?" the boy asked. Holt looked down at him. His horse was slightly larger than Took, although nowhere near the size of the giant battle horses kept in the Baron stable. "I believe it's Abelard," he said. "Abelard?" Will repeated. "What kind of name is that?" It's Gaelic," said the ranger, obviously putting an end to the conversation. They rode a few kilometers further in silence. The sun was lowering over the trees now, and their shadows were long and distorted on the ground in front of them. Will studied Took's shadow. The pony seemed to have enormously long legs and ridiculously short body. He wanted to call Holt's attention to it, but thought that such a frivolous observation would not impress the ranger. Instead, he summoned the courage to ask another question that he had been occupying his thoughts for some days. "Holt?" he said again. The ranger sighed briefly. "What now?" His tone definitely did not encourage further conversation. However, Will pressed on. "Remember you told me how a ranger was responsible for Morgareth's defeat?" Holt grunted. "Well, I was just wondering, what was the ranger's name?" "Names aren't important. I really can't remember." "Was it you?" Will continued. "Sure that it was." Holt turned that level, unsmiling gaze on him again. "I said names aren't important." There was a silence between them for some seconds. Then the ranger said, "Do you know what is important?" Will shook his head. Supper. Supper is important," said the ranger, "and we'll be late for it if we don't hurry." He clapped his heels onto Abelard's side, and the horse shot away like an arrow from Holt's own bow, leaving Will and Took far behind in a matter of seconds. Will touched Took's sides with his own heels, and the little pony raced off in pursuit of his bigger friend. "Come on, Took, let's show them how a real ranger horse can run." Chapter 15. Will Road took slowly through the crowded fairground that had been set up outside the castle halls. All the villagers and inhabitants of the castle itself seemed to be out, and he had to ride carefully to ensure that Took didn't step on somebody's foot. It was harvest day, the day when all the crops had been gathered and stored for the winter months ahead. After hard months of harvesting, the Baron traditionally allowed his people a holiday every year at this time. The traveling fair came to the castle and set up its booths and stalls. There were fire eaters and jugglers, singers and storytellers. There were stalls where you could attempt to win prizes by throwing soft leather balls at pyramids made from bottle-shaped pieces of wood, or by throwing hoops over squares. Will sometimes thought that the squares were perhaps just a little larger than the hoops that one was giving to throw, and he had never actually seen anyone win one of the prizes. It was all fun, and the Baron paid for it from his own purse. Right now, however, Will was not concerned with the fair and its attractions. There would be a time later in the day for that. At the moment he was on his way to meet his former ward mates. By tradition, all the craft masters gave their apprentices the day off on harvest day, even though they had taken no part in the actual harvest themselves. Will had been wondering for weeks whether or not Holt would conform to the practice. The ranger seemed to take no notice of tradition and had his own way of doing things, but 2 nights before his anxiety had been settled. Holt had gruffly told him that he could have the holiday, adding that he would probably forget everything that he had learned in the past 3 months. Those 3 months had been a time of constant practice with his bow and the knife that Holt had given him. 3 months of stalking through the fields outside the castle, moving from one scant patch of cover to the next, trying to make his way unobserved by Holt's eagle eyes. 3 months of riding and caring for Took, of forming a special bond of friendship with the little pony, that he thought he had been most enjoyable part of it all. Now he was ready for a holiday and ready to enjoy himself a little. Even the thought that Horace would be there couldn't dim the pleasure. Maybe, he thought, a few months' hard training in battle school had changed Horace's aggressive manner a little. It was Jenny who had arranged the meeting for the holiday, encouraging the others to join her with the promise of a batch of fresh mince pies that she would bring from the kitchen. She was already one of Master Chup's prized pupils, and he boasted of her artistry to anyone who would listen, giving suitable emphasis to the vital role his training had played in developing her skill, of course. Will's stomach grumbled with pleasure at the thought of those pies. He was starving, since he had intentionally gone without breakfast, so as to leave room for them. Jenny's pies were already legendary in Castle Redmond. He had arrived at the meeting point early, so he dismounted and led Took into the shade of an apple tree. The little pony craned his head and looked wistfully at the apples on the branches, well out of his reach. Will grinned at him and scrambled quickly up the tree, picking an apple and handing it to the pony. "That's all you get. You know what Holt says about you eating too much." Took shook his head impatiently. That was still a matter of disagreement between him and the ranger. Will looked around. There was no sign of the others, so he sat down in the shade of the tree, leaning his back against the knobbly trunk to wait. Why, it's young Will, isn't it?" said a deep voice close behind him. Will scrambled hastily to his feet and touched his forehead in a polite salute. It was Baron Errol himself, seated astride his giant battle horse and accompanied by several of his senior knights. "Yes, sir," said Will nervously. He wasn't used to being addressed by the Baron. "A happy harvest day to you, sir." The Baron nodded in acknowledgement and leaned forward, slouching comfortably in his saddle. Will had to crane his neck to look up at him. "I must say, young man, you look quite the part there. I hardly saw you in that grey ranger cloak. Has Holt been teaching you all his tricks already?" Will glanced down at the grey and green molded cloak that he was wearing. Holt had given it to him some weeks ago. He'd shown Will how the grey and green mottling broke up the shape of the wearer and helped him blend into the landscape. It was one of the reasons, he'd said, why rangers could move unseen with such ease. "It's the cloak, sir. Holt calls it camouflage." The Baron nodded, obviously familiar with the term, which had been a new concept to Will. "Just make sure you don't use it to steal more cakes," he said with mock severity, and Will shook his head hurriedly. Oh no, sir, he said immediately. Holt told me that if I did anything like that, he'd tan me the skin of my backside. He stopped awkwardly. He wasn't sure if backside was one of the sort of words you used in the presence of someone as exalted as the Baron. The Baron nodded again, trying not to let a wide grin break through. I'm sure he did. And how are you getting on with Holt, Will? Are you enjoying learning to be a ranger? Will paused. To be honest, he hadn't had the time to think he was enjoying himself or not. His days were too busy learning new skills, practicing with bow and knives, and working with Took. This was the first time in 3 months he'd had a moment to actually think about it. I suppose so. Only, his voice trailed off, and the Baron looked at him more closely. Only what? He prompted. Will shifted from one foot to the other, wishing that his mouth didn't continually get him into these situations by talking too much. Words had a way of emerging before he'd actually really had time to consider whether he wanted to say them or not. Only, Holt never smiles at all, he went on awkwardly. He's always so serious about things. He had the impression that the Baron was suppressing another grin. Well, being a ranger is a serious business, you know. I'm sure Holt has impressed that on you. All the time, Will said ruefully, and this time the Baron couldn't help smiling. Just pay attention to what he tells you, youngster, he said. You're learning a very important job there. Yes, sir. Will was a little surprised to realize that he did agree with the Baron. Baron Harold reached forward to gather up his reins. On an impulse before the nobleman could ride away, Will stepped forward. Excuse me, sir, he said hesitantly, and the Baron turned back to him. Yes, Will? Will shuffled his feet again, then went on. Sir, remember when our armies fought Morgarath? Baron Harold's cheerful face was clouded by a thoughtful frown. I'll never forget that in a hurry, boy. What about it? Sir, Holt tells me that a ranger showed the cavalry a secret way across the slip sunder, so they were able to attack the enemy's rear. That's true. I've been wondering, sir, what was the ranger's name? Will finished, feeling himself flush with the boldness. Didn't Holt tell you? The Baron asked. Will shrugged his shoulders. He says names weren't important. He said supper was important, but not names. But do you think names are important in spite of what your masters has told? Said the Baron, seeming to frown again. Will gulped and went on. I think it was Holt himself, sir, and I wondered why he hadn't been decorated or honored for his skill. The Baron thought for a moment, then spoke again. Well, you're right, Will. It was Holt, and I wanted to honor him for it, but he wouldn't allow me. He said that wasn't the ranger's way. But, Will began in a perplexed tone, but the Baron's upraised hand stopped him from speaking any further. You rangers have your own ways, Will, as I'm sure you're learning. Sometimes other people don't understand them. Just listen to Holt and do as he does, and I'm sure you'll have an honorable life ahead of you. Yes, sir, Will saluted again, as the Baron slapped his rein lightly on his horse's neck and turned him away toward the fairground. Now enough of this, said the Baron. We can't chatter all day. I'm off to the fair. Maybe this year I'll get a hoop over one of those damn squares. The Baron started to ride away. Then a thought seemed to strike him as he'd reined in for a second. Will? He called. Yes, sir. Don't tell Holt that I told you he led the cavalry. I don't want him angry with me.